Ellen Hart just wanted peace in her late father's home. But the HOA saw a quiet widow and smelled control. They fined her, threatened her, mocked her. What they didn't know, she's the judge whose signature their entire authority depends on. And she just revoked it, permanently. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. When my husband passed away 5 years ago, I learned how quiet a home could become. When my father passed 6 months ago, I learned how loud memories could be. The house he left me wasn't extravagant. White brick, red shutters, a porch swing that moaned when the wind hit just right. But it stood on land he had fought to keep, in a neighborhood he believed would one day respect history more than regulations. That day never came. I moved in quietly, just a single moving truck, 2 days after the funeral. I didn't speak to anyone, not the couple across the street with matching Labradors. Not the elderly woman who watched from her window like it was a full-time job, and certainly not the 3 men, in golf polos, who arrived an hour after I unpacked my last box. They didn't knock, they rang the bell twice and stood with clipboards tucked under their arms, like suburban prosecutors. The one in the center introduced himself as Mr. Richard Gaines, president of the Brookstone Hills Homeowners Association. He had the smile of a man who only practiced it in the mirror. The two behind him nodded in sync. Mark and Tony, I later learned, board members. Loyal. Forgettable. Ma'am, Richard began, without asking my name. Welcome to Brookstone Hills. We do like to greet all new residents personally. A little tradition of ours. I said thank you. He didn't seem to hear it. I see you've inherited the property from Mr. Leland Hart, he continued, eyeing the front porch like it personally offended him. We had a few ongoing conversations with him about certain non-compliant elements of the home. I nodded slowly. I'm aware. He smiled. Good. We do expect all residents to adhere to community standards. And now that the house has transitioned ownership, we hope to resolve a few legacy issues. Legacy. They said it like it was dust on a shelf. The statue in the front yard, a bronze casting of an open book that my father commissioned after he retired from teaching, was apparently a violation. The porch swing was not architecturally harmonious. Even the rose trellis that curved over the mailbox was cited as non-uniform landscaping. I said I'd review the HOA guidelines. I said it without expression, without hinting who I was. Who I really was. I'd learned long ago that in certain spaces, silence is armor. And sometimes, underestimation is a weapon. The truth is, I didn't move back just for the house. I moved because this neighborhood was the last place where my father's voice echoed off the walls. Because the judge's bench I sat on every weekday morning felt colder with each year, and the city courthouse that once challenged me now felt like a place where the living came to delay the inevitable. I needed something grounded, familiar, personal. Brookstone Hills, for all its curated charm and tightly trimmed hedges, was none of those things. But my father's house was. It was where I learned to tie my shoes, where my mother had painted sunflowers on the kitchen wall in defiance of beige norms, where my dad, every Saturday morning, would sit on that swing with a thermos of coffee and whisper things to the wind like it would remember them for him. This house wasn't mine because of a will. It was mine because every creak in the floorboards still knew my name. The HOA, of course, didn't care about sentiment. They cared about uniformity, control, appearances, and something about a quiet, widowed woman returning alone to a non-compliant property on their block must have stirred their sense of entitlement. Richard Gaines made sure to stop by again. A few days later, this time with a printed packet of welcome materials and a highlighted section on fines for violations. He looked at me like I might need help understanding the big words. Just a heads up, he said. We take compliance seriously here. But we're reasonable. If you need guidance, the board is here. He didn't ask what I did for a living. I didn't offer it. Because if there's one thing my job taught me, it's that truth, when delivered at the right time, doesn't need volume, just precision. They thought I was a grieving woman clinging to a dying house. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just here to live in it. I was here to protect it. And I wasn't just any woman. I was the one who signed their charter. The first notice came folded in thirds, slipped inside my mailbox like a casual suggestion. Subject, non-compliant mailbox color. Apparently, black wasn't on the approved palette. The letter included a swatch of acceptable tones, variations of beige, slate gray, and what they called stone cream. It felt less like color regulation and more like an effort to bleach the neighborhood into submission. I set the letter on my kitchen table. I didn't respond. The second came 3 days later. Subject, unapproved garden statue. This time, they attached a photo of my father's bronze sculpture, the open book cradled in stone hands, sitting at the edge of the front garden where he had placed it 22 years ago. Distracting and not in architectural harmony, it said. I ran my fingers along the edge of the page. That statue had stood longer than any of the current board members had lived here. My father used to call it his public thesis, a tribute to knowledge, quietly placed among the roses. Now it was a violation. By the third letter regarding the interior curtain shade visible from the street, I began to notice a pattern. They weren't correcting me. They were challenging me. I attended the next HOA board meeting out of formality, not obligation. It was held in the community clubhouse, a building so sterile it might have been designed to offend no one, and thus pleased no one. Fluorescent lighting, lukewarm coffee, and a small table of stale donuts completed the ambiance. Richard Gaines sat at the head of the long table like he was presiding over Congress. He gave me a brief nod when I entered, the kind that doesn't acknowledge your humanity so much as your presence. The room smelled faintly of copy paper and overcompensation. Miss Hart, he said, glancing at his agenda sheet without looking up. I see you've received a few notices. We thought it best to clarify expectations in person. I've read them, I replied calmly. And I'm here to understand the process better. Could I get a copy of the HOA bylaws, just so I know my rights? That seemed to amuse him more than concern him. Mark, seated 2 chairs down, chuckled quietly and nudged Tony. I pretended not to notice. Of course, Richard said, gesturing to a board member who began shuffling through a folder with exaggerated slowness. We're always happy to educate. Our job is to maintain community standards. Aesthetic harmony is critical in preserving property values. I see, I nodded, scanning the faces around me. So things like mailbox paint or curtain fabric directly impact the neighborhood economy. He paused. They impact perception, and perception impacts value. We have to consider the whole ecosystem. Ecosystem. As if this suburban grid of chemically identical lawns and concrete driveways was a rainforest. I let them continue, let them condescend, let them mock my non-standard garden choices with terms like eccentric and disruptive. Tony offered a gentle reminder that persistent non-compliance could eventually lead to escalated measures. Eviction was never said out loud, but it didn't need to be. They wanted me nervous. They wanted me isolated. A single woman in a house that carried too much memory and not enough obedience. But what they didn't realize, what men like Richard never realize, is that there's a particular strength that lives in silence. And in the law, silence doesn't mean surrender. It means you're gathering. Back at home, I placed the 3 violation letters on my father's old oak desk. I reread them slowly, the way I would read a deposition. I highlighted language, circled vague terms like harmonious aesthetic and historically approved finishes. I flipped through the bylaws they'd handed me, printed double-sided and stapled at odd angles like an afterthought. And then I found something. A line buried deep in the procedural section, in small print that hadn't been updated in over a decade. All active enforcement privileges remain contingent upon charter ratification by a currently seated municipal judicial officer, renewed every 10 calendar years. My breath caught. I looked at the last ratification date, scribbled in the appendix. It was over 11 years ago. Their authority, the very foundation of their violations, was expired. Unratified, legally brittle. They didn't know. But I did. I stepped outside just before dusk. The garden statue glowed bronze in the fading sunlight, half-shadowed by the rose bushes. Unseen strength. That's what my father called it once. When you build something to last, not to boast. Something quiet, resilient, like knowledge, or character, or steel wrapped in silence. I brushed a fallen petal off the stone hand. Then I smiled. Let them keep sending their letters. I wasn't just reading them. I was building my case. It started with a cup of tea and a highlighter. The violation notices were piling up on the corner of my desk, fanned out like accusation leaflets from a neighborhood coup. I'd been reading them like threats, but now I started reading them like evidence. The bylaws were printed on cheap paper, riddled with inconsistent formatting and vague language, clearly cobbled together by people who understood enforcement, but not structure. I approached it the way I would any court document, slow, methodical, pencil in hand, looking for what wasn't said as much as what was. On the third evening, just as the wind stirred the chimes outside and the kettle whistled behind me, I found it. A paragraph, centered awkwardly on the bottom of page 17, section 8. All active enforcement privileges of this homeowners association remain contingent upon charter validation by a seated municipal judicial officer, renewed on a decennial basis. Decennial. Every 10 years. I checked the appendix. The last judicial sign-off was dated March 3rd, 11 years ago. No addendum, no renewal, no footnote suggesting a pending reauthorization. My heart slowed. I read the clause again, and then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't seeing something I wanted to see. I wasn't. They'd missed it. All of them. For over a year they'd been operating without legal authority, sending fines, threatening lanes, issuing public reprimands, all under a charter that had quietly expired. Their power wasn't just fragile, it was fictional. And I wasn't just any resident. I was a sitting civil court judge for the county they were supposed to serve under. My signature was the very thing they needed to remain legitimate, and they hadn't even bothered to ask for it. I sat back in my father's leather chair, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the bronze statue outside the window. The open book gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its pages frozen in silent defiance. For years they'd told him it didn't fit the aesthetic. But he never moved it. Not once. Now I understood why. Some things you don't move, not because they're allowed, but because they're right. And some things don't break under pressure. They wait. I didn't storm into the HOA office. I didn't call Richard Gaines or demand a meeting. That's not how you move when the ground is soft under someone else's feet. No, I started quietly. I called the city clerk's office and confirmed the policy. Yes, every HOA charter in the county requires judicial ratification every 10 years to remain in effect. Yes, there's a public record of the last signatures. No, there had been no renewal request from Brookstone Hills since. That confirmation hit me deeper than I expected. I wasn't angry. I was calm. The kind of calm that settles over you when the balance of power shifts without a word being spoken. For a week, I went about my days as if nothing had changed. I pulled weeds. I read his files. I waved at the neighbors who didn't know what storm was building beneath the HOA's well-manicured lawn. Let them think they were still in control. Let them keep sending notices backed by a hollow charter. Let them keep speaking over me in meetings, underestimating my silence. Because soon they'd understand what it meant to build authority on paper and forget who holds the pen. It came in a manila envelope. Hand-delivered, no return address. The letterhead read, Brookstone Hills Homeowners Association. The wording was more aggressive now, less polished, less neighborly. Final notice of non-compliance. You are hereby informed that failure to correct listed violations within 30 calendar days will result in formal eviction proceedings pursuant to community bylaws and code enforcement protocols. They always hid behind vague threats. Protocols, proceedings, words that looked intimidating until you held them up to the light. I folded the letter slowly and laid it beside the first three, aligned neatly like exhibits. 30 days. That's what they gave me. I gave them 6. On the 7th day, I sat at my desk, the same desk where my father used to draft speeches for school board meetings and budget proposals he knew would be ignored. I opened a clean Word document. No emotion. Just the facts. To the Brookstone Hills HOA Board, read Judicial Charter, ratification. I kept it clinical, surgical. I cited the exact clause from their own charter, Section 8.4, the one requiring judicial reauthorization every 10 years. I referenced the municipal code that governs HOA legitimacy in the county. I highlighted the lapse in their charter's legal standing. And then I added the line that would change everything. As a current sitting municipal civil court judge, I declined to renew or validate the Brookstone Hills HOA charter at this time, based on procedural failures, abuse of authority, and lack of compliance with governing standards. I printed it on official letterhead. I signed it. I sealed it with my judicial notary stamp and included a certified copy of my judicial ID for authentication. The final page was a formal notification to the county recorder's office. Their power, what little they thought they had, was now invalidated by the only person legally authorized to make it so. Me. It wasn't revenge, it was jurisdiction. I didn't slam doors or raise my voice. I didn't need to. Power, real power, doesn't have to announce itself. It arrives in ink, in legal language, in the cold, quiet certainty of knowing you're right and they're defenseless. 2 days later, I sent the packet to the HOA office by certified mail. I made sure Richard Gaines had to sign for it personally. He did. I pictured his expression as he flipped through the pages, the realization setting in like cold water over bare skin. The woman he tried to evict wasn't just a resident with a defiant streak. She was the one thing they never accounted for. The one thing their charter depended on. I wasn't in violation. They were. That evening, my doorbell rang. I didn't answer. They didn't leave a note. The next morning, a neighbor told me Richard was seen pacing outside the HOA clubhouse, waving a folder and barking into his phone. By noon, 2 board members had already started calling an emergency meeting. But there was nothing to vote on, nothing to appeal. Without a valid charter, their enforcement privileges were void. Every warning letter, every fine, every attempted eviction, all of it rested on a document that I had the sole authority to validate. And I had declined. The statue in my garden stood untouched, surrounded by roses in full bloom. I added mulch that didn't match the approved color scheme. I didn't ask permission. No more warnings came. No more letters. The silence was louder now, but it was mine. For years they governed by intimidation, assuming no one would ever question the machinery. They wielded authority like a cudgel, not knowing the hinge it swung on was me. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so common. Men like Richard Gaines never expect the woman they underestimate to hold the final piece of the structure they stand on. They see a porch swing and think fragility. They see a statue and think defiance. They never look close enough to see what holds it all together. Let them. I had no intention of rebuilding their authority. I simply removed it. Power doesn't vanish quietly. It thrashes, claws, and flails in the dark when stripped away. Especially from men who built their worth on illusion and compliance. 3 days after Richard Gaines signed for the letter invalidating the HOA's charter, the retaliation began. It didn't come with sirens or subpoenas. It came with whispers. First, it was the folded flyer slipped under every door on my block, printed in shaky typeface on plain paper, unsigned of course. Did you know the woman at 137 Rosemary Lane has a history of unstable behavior? Should a judge really be living here unchecked? Unstable. A word that stains without proof. Then came the lawn stair brigade, neighbors who used to wave now watching me from behind curtains, expressions unreadable like they were calculating how close proximity to me might affect their property value. I kept to my routines, garden in the morning, legal review in the evening. No changes. But inside, something began to shift. Not fear, not quiet, doubt. Not about the law, that part was clean, but about the cost. Richard called a private emergency HOA board meeting 2 days later, even though legally the HOA no longer had standing. The irony didn't slow him down. One of my neighbors, Mrs. Dempsey, whose grandson I helped avoid eviction after a court mishap last year, called me afterward. They were livid, she whispered over the phone. Richard said you fabricated the authority to revoke the charter. He's claiming conflict of interest. I let the silence stretch before replying. It's not a conflict to follow the law, it's a conflict to break it and expect immunity. She exhaled. They're trying to scare you. I know. It escalated that night. I found an envelope on my porch. No postage, no return name, just my address scribbled in uneven handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You should leave before it gets worse. That was all it said. No signature, no threat, technically, just a warning steeped in cowardice. Words again. Always paper, always typed. Their battles were fought through mail slots and margins, weaponizing suggesting instead of proof. I sat on the porch swing and read the note again in the fading dusk. The wind moved gently through the chimes above, and I thought of my father. How often he said the most dangerous men weren't the ones who raised their fists. They were the ones who whispered in rooms they didn't build. For a moment I faltered. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe I should have handled it more delicately. Submitted the non-renewal without the judicial seal. Let the county review it quietly. Maybe the whispers would snowball into an official ethics inquiry, or worse, threaten my bench. But then I remembered my father's voice. If you don't stand firm when it's personal, you'll bend everywhere else. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was legacy. They weren't angry because I broke the rules. They were furious because I knew the rules better than they did, and used them. I went inside and drafted a formal response to the ethics rumor, logging it with the county clerk's office. I attached copies of my credentials, my conflict of interest disclosure, and the statute that gave me sole authority to approve HOA charters in our jurisdiction. Just facts. No emotion. I also mailed a notarized copy of the revocation letter to the city zoning board to eliminate any doubt about jurisdiction. And then I made tea. Because bullies rely on escalation. But silence, fortified by precision, is what makes them unravel. The next day, the whispers got louder. But they started sounding like echoes, familiar phrases recycled from insecurity. She thinks she's above the rules. She doesn't belong here. She's making things uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That word always shows up when power shifts out of its expected hands. I took a walk around the block that evening, head high, smile soft but unshaken. I passed Richard's house. His blinds twitched. Let them talk. Let them print flyers and scribble threats and hold shadow meetings in clubhouses. They no longer legally govern. They had paper, but I had precedent. And precedent always holds in court. The HOA's charter, expired for over a year, was now formally revoked. No court challenge, no hearing. Just statute, followed precisely. Their entire enforcement mechanism, fines, warnings, eviction threats, ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. By the time Richard Gaines opened his next email from the city, his authority was already a ghost. 2 mornings later, a maintenance worker was seen drilling into the entrance sign of Brookstone Hills. By noon, a fresh aluminum panel had been bolted in place. Private community. No current HOA oversight. It wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. For the first time in decades, the name of the neighborhood stood without the letters HOA underneath. By sunset, neighbors began drifting out of their homes like fog lifting after a storm. Mrs. Dempsey knocked first. She brought lemon cookies and an envelope of old violation letters she'd kept just in case. She asked what the sign meant, if it was true. "It is," I said. "They can't enforce anything anymore." Her shoulders dropped. She smiled so wide I thought she might cry. "Good," she whispered. It never felt like home with them watching. Word spread quickly. Not just about the charter, about me, about who I was. The woman in 1137 wasn't just a widow with a stubborn mailbox and a bronze garden statue. She was the reason they were all free. By the weekend, 3 more neighbors came by to ask if I could help them remove old liens the HOA had placed on their properties. Another brought me a folder of community proposals that had been rejected over the years. Backyard gardens, solar panel installations, even a bench by the pond. "You think we can try again?" she asked. I looked out at the street, at the homes no longer bound by beige tyranny, at the yards beginning to bloom with individuality. "Yes," I said. "You can start over, on your terms." I never raised my voice. I never called a crowd. But the power shift had happened all the same. They ruled with assumptions. I responded with law. They wrote warnings on paper. I rewrote the foundation they stood on.
And when the structure collapsed, I didn't cheer.
I just went back to tending the roses. Because some battles aren't won when someone loses. They're won when everyone else stops being afraid to live how they want. It started with a knock. Not aggressive, not uncertain. Just a polite, rhythmic tap on the front door around 9 a.m. I opened it to find a young woman standing there in a faded blazer with a press badge clipped to her belt and a notebook already open. "Judge Hart," she asked. I'm Cassidy Blake, local reporter with the Brooke County Chronicle. I tilted my head slightly. I don't recall reaching out. You didn't, she said, with a half-apologetic smile. But someone did, and now half the county wants to know how one woman quietly dissolved the most powerful HOA in Brookstone Hills. I considered closing the door, but instead I stepped aside and motioned her in. The interview was short. She asked how I discovered the expired charter. I told her the truth. Buried bylaws, overlooked timelines, procedural negligence. No vengeance. No vendetta. Just legal clarity. I didn't speak ill of Richard Gaines. I didn't name names. Cassidy wrote quietly, her pen barely pausing. When she asked why I hadn't published my role sooner, I simply said, because justice doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be done. She paused, then looked up at me like she hadn't expected that answer. By the next morning, the headline was live. Judge silently shuts down rogue HOA. It spread faster than I expected. Someone posted it in the community Facebook group. Someone else printed copies and pinned them to mailboxes like victory figgies. The whispers that once painted me unstable now shifted into something else entirely. Respect. Or, at least, reluctant admiration. Richard Gaines didn't show his face for 2 weeks. His mailbox overflowed. A for sale sign appeared on his lawn 3 days later. 2 board members resigned the same week. One of them left a note in my mailbox. We should have handled things differently. You were right. No signature. But it didn't need one. Something strange began to happen after that. Color returned. Not just in attitude, but in form. Porch doors were painted blue, yellow, even a bold red. Children's chalk art began creeping back onto sidewalks that had once received citations. A woman planted wildflowers in a yard that used to be trimmed with a ruler. The fences didn't come down, but the fear did. And that was enough. My father always said justice wasn't about winning, it was about restoring balance. This wasn't a war I chose, but it was one I was equipped to end. Without a courtroom, without a robe, without a gavel. Just quiet truth, delivered at the right time. And still, the sound of it echoed. The folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle, not rows. It was a symbolic choice, I realized. Less hierarchical, more communal. A way to say we're all equal here now, though the nerves in the room said otherwise. The community clubhouse, once the nerve center of HOA authority, buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Curious, tentative, hopeful. The agenda had one item: open discussion, future governance of Brookstone Hills. I sat in the back, not hiding, just waiting. I didn't come to lead. I came to witness. Neighbors spoke first, those who'd once feared being fined for planting lavender too close to the curb. A retired schoolteacher asked if we even needed an HOA. A young couple mentioned wanting bike racks near the park. A single father brought up the years of selective enforcement and late-night warnings taped to his door. The room was starting to shift from venting to vision. Then the door opened, and Richard Gaines walked in. He looked older than he had a month ago. Thinner, paler, he clutched a folder like it might protect him. I'd like to speak, he said, walking to the center. The room tensed. I know mistakes were made, he began, carefully. But the HOA provided structure, order. Without it, we've got chaos. People doing whatever they want. No oversight. Someone coughed. He turned, scanning the room. Then he saw me. I've read the law, he said, voice tightening. And technically, the charter could still be reinstated if a judge authorized it. Then he looked at me directly. And I'm asking, would you consider signing it again? Reinstating the original charter? The room went silent. I stood, walked slowly to the front. Not to intimidate, just to be seen. My voice didn't need volume, just clarity. No. A ripple of breath moved through the chairs. I turned to face everyone. I won't reinstate a charter built on exclusion, intimidation, and unchecked power. That document allowed for abuse disguised as order. It created enforcers without accountability, and neighbors who feared their own homes. Richard tried to speak again, but I raised a hand, gently cutting through him without aggression. And worse, I continued, it exposed every one of you to legal risk. Unratified authority means every action taken under that charter Fines, lanes, threats was potentially invalid. If someone had challenged it in court, this neighborhood would have been dragged through months of litigation. Gasps. Soft murmurs. Someone whispered, "They never told us that." I took a breath and steadied my tone. "But I'm not here to punish anyone." I glanced toward Richard, then looked past him. "I'm here to offer this. I'll help you draft a new charter. One with transparency, term limits, rotating leadership, a vote for every decision, a clause requiring review by residents, not just a board." The room shifted again. Postures straightened, heads nodded. Then I said it. "If you want rules, make them with the people, not against them." That was the moment. A pause, then applause, quiet at first, then louder. Someone stood. A woman in the front row clapped with both hands pressed together like prayer. And from the back, I heard a whisper that carried farther than any speech. "She saved us." Richard didn't respond. He just nodded stiffly, clutched his folder tighter, and sat down, for once not at the head of the table. Power had moved on. And this time, it belonged to the people who lived here. Seasons changed, almost without notice. The roses bloomed wider this year, fuller, freer. Their petals spilled past the brick path, creeping into spaces once trimmed with military precision. No one clipped them back. No warnings came in the mail. No violation slips tucked under windshield wipers. Just the wind, the smell of lemon pie from Mrs. Dempsey's kitchen, and the sound of laughter echoing between yards that used to be too quiet. Brookstone Hills had changed. And so had I. It took 3 months to establish the new community association. No longer called an HOA, just the Brookstone Circle, named after the layout of the street, rather than any imagined symbol of control. They held the first open election in the clubhouse. Folding chairs again, but this time arranged in a true circle. No podium, no raised voices, just ballots, laughter, and coffee poured, without tension. They asked if I would run. I declined gently. "I have a garden," I said. "That's more than enough power for me." And I meant it. The children were the first to test the limits of the new freedom. Sidewalk chalk bloomed across the pavement like pastel vines. One girl drew a castle stretching across 3 driveways, labeled each turret with names of her friends. A boy strung solar lights across the low branches of a magnolia tree and called it the backyard fort. Once upon a time, their parents would have pulled them inside before dusk, afraid of a knock from the HOA or a fine in the mail. Now they stayed out longer. They waved at me when I passed. Sometimes they ran ahead and cleared the path, guarding the statue like it was sacred. Maybe it was. The bronze hands in my garden hadn't been touched since the day my father placed them. Open palms cradling the heavy book he called Legacy. He had once said, "The most important knowledge isn't the loudest. It's what holds everything up." I never truly understood it until the moment I watched a community come back to life. Not with banners or speeches, but in the quiet choices people made when fear was no longer a resident. A neighbor I barely knew stopped by one afternoon. He brought apple pie in a dish too nice to be disposable. "I never got the chance to thank you," he said, eyes full of something that wasn't just relief. "You gave us back our homes." I smiled, accepted the pie, and told him the truth. "I didn't give anything, I just reminded them they already had it." Some nights, I sit on the porch swing and listen. Not for danger, not for footsteps or whispers. Just for the stillness. Because peace, when earned, hums like a quiet instrument, steady and low. It hums when kids ride their scooters past your mailbox. When neighbors plant what they want and don't ask permission. When sunflowers lean defiantly over fences that once had to be trimmed at 90-degree angles. It hums in the soft creak of the swing your father never replaced. It hums in bronze. Richard Gaines moved out quietly. A month after the final meeting. The house is still for sale. No one's in a hurry to buy it. Not because it's flawed, but because something about it still echoes with the wrong kind of silence. No one has touched the statue. Not even the new association. It's unspoken, but understood. That statue belongs to the neighborhood now. Not just to me. Not just to my father. But to what we all endured. And what we decided would never happen again. A community was reclaimed. Not by protests or petitions. but by a single woman with a memory, a legal clause, and the will to act when others wouldn't. Justice didn't come in a wave. It came like roots beneath the foundation. Slow, quiet, unshakable. The house they tried to take became the one they couldn't touch. Ever faced power that wasn't earned? Ever watched silence outplay control? Then you belong in stories like this, where the law whispers louder than threats. Stick around, because the next neighborhood showdown might be closer than you think.